The following program was previously recorded.
I probably don't even need to tell you that, of course, is the song Jormungand by the group Skald. I assume that's just self-evident to everybody. No, actually, it turns out there are a lot of groups. There's sort of a Norsecore movement these days. There are a lot of artists, musical artists in Europe, and not just in Scandinavia, who are trying to recreate some of the sounds of Viking music, trying even to recreate the instruments themselves that might have been used. One of the many things I've learned a lot about getting ready for this show. And it all started because I was listening to a podcast I just discovered called Dead to Me. And there was this fascinating person on talking about Leif Erikson. And her name was Eleanor Barraclough, historian, writer, and broadcaster based at Bath Spa University. Her new book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. And the minute I got through listening to this podcast, I said to my producer, we're doing a show about Vikings as soon as possible. And so now that the book is out, we have Eleanor here, and we're very excited. So, first of all, welcome to our show.
Thank you so much. I've never had such a good introduction. That music, we're just boogieing on both sides of the Atlantic, basically.
Yes, it is. It's a bop. It's a banger.
So good.
So, and the Vikings said a song was a banger. They often meant that literally. Although we should freeze it right there and say the Vikings have a branding problem. And their branding problem is their name, because their name contains the idea of being raiders. So that becomes 90% of their story somehow. This book of yours is an effort to do a little something to balance those scales. But say more about that.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So I think the Vikings would have felt they didn't have a branding problem at all. They'd be so happy. They're like, yes, we are that badass. Thank you for recognizing it 1,000 years later. And that's the good thing, that there is truth in that. And that's important because most of us are into the Vikings because, they're badass. They're dramatic. You've got that incredible mythology. You've got all the sagas, all the adventures. But yeah, that's the problem is that word Viking, which is Old Norse, which is the language they spoke, essentially just means raider or pirate. And then you go on a Viking, you go on a raid. But no one's doing that all the time. You've got to go back home. You've got to farm. You've got to fish. You've got to trade. And so it's just trying to open that world up a little bit more and look for everyone else underneath those headlines and those brilliant nicknames like, Hairy Britches and, Forkbeard. It's looking for everyone else who was in the Viking Age, basically.
So, one of the revelations for me right at the start was I think I had in my head this latent idea that it was a kind of, that the raiding part of this was a kind of hit and run, smash and grab. We're going to take your stuff, maybe take a few slaves with us too, and we're going to head back to our beehive huts or wherever it is that we're living. And I didn't understand the degree to which they inserted themselves in the world. I mean, and I want you to talk about this, but one of the revelations, to the extent that I understood that they were inserted in a world, I was thinking kind of, their Western migrations, their visits to England and Greenland and even the coast of North America. I didn't understand, and I have a Swedish friend who wanted me to know right away. I mean, he's from Stockholm. That the Swedish Vikings went through Ukraine and down to Constantinople and to Baghdad and experienced, the caliphate. And these are not people who would just grab stuff and head back to Norway. These are people who really lived lives in these places.
Yeah, that's exactly it. So there were hit and run raids and plenty of them. And even when you have these sort of the Norse, the Vikings, whatever we want to call them, the Rus, as they often get called when they head down those waterways through Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, and so on, there are plenty of hit and run raids, excuse me, especially in the early years. So when we think of, you mentioned England, there's that great famous raid in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle, the year 793. They say, in this year, great portents appeared in the skies. There were dragons, there were sheets of lightning. And then the Northmen attack the monastery at Lindisfarne. That's absolutely true. And there's plenty of that. But exactly as you say, that's not the whole story. And exactly as your Swedish friend says, so much is about going east as well. And in fact, back in, I think it's 2013 now, so just over 10 years, there was a big discovery made on an Estonian island at a place called Salme. And they found this pair of, well, one Viking ship, one Viking boat, or at least Norse from Sweden, for the most part, with people who are from around Stockholm, Lake Mälaren. And it was a mass grave and they'd been killed. And it looks like that they'd been going east, not to raid, but essentially to open up diplomatic routes and therefore trading routes. And so that story, even at its initial stages, and here we're talking sort of almost 50 years before that first raid on Lindisfarne that's so famous, it's kind of 750 or so, that the first raids, the first expeditions rather, aren't just about raiding. There's a lot more going on. And as time goes on, exactly as you say, they start to insert themselves into cultures, not just sort of put their own cultures on top, although there is some of that in certain places, but very much embed themselves in these worlds. And that's a far more interesting story, in my opinion.
Yeah, and even Lindisfarne, we should say that attempts to kind of designate a period of time as the Viking Age, a lot of times they start at 750, almost arbitrarily because that thing happened, and often end around 1066 or 1100 for kind of similar reasons. Things happen that seem to be demarcations. But there's a lot going on before that, and my understanding of Lindisfarne is that it probably is the product of a certain amount of prior reconnaissance where the Vikings are saying, they just have these monasteries that are full of really cool stuff, and there's nobody guarding them. There's no wall. There's no spikes. You can just go and take stuff. It's not like they stumbled on Lindisfarne probably and went, wow, this is nice. They probably knew about it beforehand.
Exactly that. So we've got to think this is a really much more connected world than we sometimes give it credit for. And yes, 793, that raid on Lindisfarne, it is important. You have Alcuin, who's an Anglo-Saxon, but he's writing from the court of Charlemagne. He's saying, never before has such a terror appeared on these shores. This is bad. And he's writing to people in the northeast of England saying, essentially victim blaming, to be honest, saying, what did you do? Why has this terrible thing happened? So it's not that it's like, oh, this has been going on for a while, and for some reason Lindisfarne and the other raids that are going on in these decades is somehow just, it's been blown out of proportion. There is something significant that happens around then. But yes, exactly as you say, they don't come out of nowhere. They don't stumble upon it. We've got to think of this North Sea world as one that's about trade and connections and travel to some extent, not just, oh, they suddenly went west from Norway and there they found this magical land full of monks and treasures and it was all undefended and so they got stuck in.
Right. And the idea of an undefended monastery would be interesting to them too, at least at some point, because down in the kind of Denmark end of the Viking world, they're talking about build that wall. They actually are anticipating the idea that somebody might want to come and take their stuff. So they're doing a lot more with fortifications down there, right?
Exactly. So there's the Danevirke, like the work of the Danes, basically, this great earthwork that predates the Viking Age, but it starts to be essentially built up by the local people who are in power. And you've got to think, okay, well, what's going on south? And essentially there's this great power. There's the Frankish Empire or the Carolingian Empire, depending on exactly what period we're looking at. People like Charlemagne, who by 800, so just after those raids that are so famous up in the northeast of England, Charlemagne is a serious powerhouse. And so what you start to see is the Danes north of the border, they see what happens to the Saxons. Charlemagne, there's essentially genocide. And so they have to think, okay, how are we going to react to that? And part of it is about defense, but part of it as well is about essentially preempting what he wants to do, which is, for example, bring Christianity into Denmark. And so they do it themselves. And that's why we have Harold Bluetooth, who very famously writes or commissions rather this runestone, the Yelling runestone. And it says Harold Bluetooth, who brought Christianity to Denmark and Norway and, was this big cheese. The point is, it's Harold doing it. It's not someone coming in and doing it violently, and therefore also sort of taking political power out of Denmark.
We should just, I wasn't going to go there right now, but this is a good time to do it anyway, because you just mentioned Harold Bluetooth. That name, the name for wireless connectivity, actually, from what I can tell, actually is somebody had been reading a Scandinavian history, I think called The Long Ship. So it was a historical novel. And so somebody there in this tech company goes, well, Bluetooth, and Bluetooth is also about kind of tying things together. Harold was kind of into that. It's a little bit of a unifying theme. I mean, that's amazing to me, Eleanor.
Yeah. I absolutely love that. And it gets even better because that symbol for Bluetooth is a combination of those two runes.
Yes.
So, that spiky alphabet H and the B. So most of us are going to have runes on our phone every time we open it up. I'm staring at some now, even as I'm talking to you. So we've got that little bit. And I think my understanding is they didn't really want to keep that. It was just a placeholder. And then no one could come up with anything better. And so like most of the best things in life, they're like, well, that works. Let's stick with that.
So while we're on this, I wanted to ask you about two other words. One of them is the name Russia, because at a certain point, Vikings are in this place that they call, or somebody calls, Rus, R-U-S.
Yes.
And I'm assuming that somehow or other from there, we get to the word Russia. I think it turns up in medieval scholarship, maybe a few hundred years later. But and I'm sure Vladimir Putin doesn't like the idea that Russia, the name comes from somebody else. But it would seem to be the case, right?
Yeah, exactly. So this is quite a tricky one, and it's tricky historically in a way that goes back at least to the 19th century, which is that you have, and it sort of comes back to what you were saying at the beginning, when you have different cultures interacting in different ways, sometimes what then comes later colors how people want to understand what came before. That's very much the case with Russia and that whole area. So the Rus, that's the sort of the one of the words for the people of Norse or Scandinavian heritage who are on those waterways, so that run through Russia, run through Ukraine, all the way down to Constantinople, all the way ultimately down to the Caspian Sea, to Baghdad, as to take it to its furthest extent. And so that word Rus, yes, initially does refer to people of Norse, predominantly sort of Swedish, Eastern Scandinavian heritage. But at the same time, they're quite a small, really important, but quite a small minority, culturally speaking, because there are lots of different Slavic groups who are also very much embedded in that part of the world and who've been there a lot longer. And that's fine, because part of this is just about being able to hold apparently contradictory ideas in our head at the same time and not do that thing that's so easy to do, and certainly is easy to do sort of when history is complicated, which is essentially to pick a side and stick to it. So, Hitler, for example, unfortunately got sort of stuck into this and was saying, basically, if it weren't for the Scandinavians, then the Russians would essentially have no semblance of civilization. And obviously that's absolute rubbish. But then it works its way into the opposite way as well, where, the sort of at various points in Russia, there's been a sort of unwillingness to accept that there was any sort of Western Scandinavian presence that was sort of involved in shaping their country. So the Rus, the Norse, sort of essentially, it starts with Rurik, who comes down the sort of the Russian waterways as it is, and he establishes himself in Novgorod in 862, and that's taken to be a major starting point in Russian history, and essentially his dynasty remains powerful for many, many centuries. I think even Ivan the Terrible, pretty sure, don't quote me on it, but I think he was also part of that line. But we're dealing with sources for that come from a lot later, that come from the early 1200s, that were written down in Kiev. And what happens is, within a couple of generations, the power base shifts south to Kiev. And the culture, the civilization that comes from that, we call Kievan Rus, because essentially that's the center. And the rivers flow through Novgorod, through Kiev, and beyond to the south. And that's very much where this incredibly multicultural world of trading, raiding, settlement, control of the waterways, control of resources is sort of born. And so you can see how complex that will be. And certainly, although it starts with sort of people in charge who have Norse names, again, within a few generations, they've got Slavic names. And so we have Olga and Igor, and they're in charge. And then their child, they called Sviatoslav, which is a very Slavic name. And at that point, Sviatoslav worships Perun and Volos, who are the sort of the Slavic gods of thunder and lightning. And so by that point, the cultural dynamics have shifted. And so in a way, everyone's
complicated.
Right.
It's
complicated. It's just people could be a lot nicer about it.
I want to just move on from there. First of all, I want to quote to you. There's an American historian, sometimes criticized for being kind of a popularizer, named Will Durant. But he had this great way of thinking about this. He said, civilization is a stream with banks. The stream is sometimes filled with blood from people killing, stealing, shouting, and doing the things historians usually record. While on the banks, unnoticed, people build homes, make love, raise children, sing songs, write poetry, and even whittle statues. The story of civilization is the story of what happened on the banks. Historians are pessimists because they ignore the banks for the river. That's almost a perfect description of what you've attempted to do in this book, right? Is to tell this other story of life up on the banks. So when I think about Vikings, well, I think about them differently now. Prior to my acquaintance with you and your book, I wouldn't necessarily have thought about, for example, hair care. But it turns out it's kind of a big deal. Combs are kind of a big deal. Hair care is kind of a big deal. Say some more about that.
Yes, exactly. So what I'd say to start with that quote, which I think is really clever, it's very evocative. I think I would sort of kind of complicate it a little bit by saying, yes, civilization is built on those banks, but the rivers with the blood, they often flood. It's not a separate thing. It's not, it's not that everyone's peaceful in the banks and getting on with their lives. Like in my head, they're now little hobbits, just like playing their pipes and having a lovely time with their excellent hair, which we'll get onto. But it's not that simple. The two are connected, and this was in many ways a very brutal, bloody world where lives were often very short. So I think it's very important not to forget that. Combs are actually a really good example of this. So you find combs in so many graves from the Viking Age and all over the Viking Age. Sometimes you find them in really sort of peaceful context, but sort of that riverbank type context. And so there's one example I give, or rather two examples, but buried together from Sweden, and it's a sibling pair, brother and sister, who are buried with combs. But they actually have, both of them, a form of dwarfism. And that's quite unusual. You really don't find many examples of this. And the fact is that they lived, I think, at least into their 50s. And you could see signs of wear and tear and degeneration, of course. But the fact is they lived very ordinary lives in this very small farming community, and they were buried with combs. But then right at the other end of the scale, who else is buried with combs? Well, we mentioned the Salme ship burials from around 750 from Estonia. Well, there's a ton of combs there too, and there was nothing peaceful about how those people died. And so we see sort of things that are culturally important, but they're culturally important in all sorts of contexts. But as you say, Vikings really cared about their hair. And I absolutely love that fact because you see, so one of my favorite little exhibits, I think it's in the British Museum, and it's sort of tucked away because it's not as exciting to look at. Let's not kid ourselves, compared to, say, I don't know, the great sort of burial at Sutton Hoo in East England, full of kind of bling and armor and that very famous helmet. It's just a comb case made of bone, probably antler, from Lincoln, which is sort of somewhere in the Midlands, in the East Midlands of England, and from the Viking Age. And they found this little comb case, so you keep a comb in it, and it's got runes carved on it, and they say Thorfast made a good comb. And so we know the name of the person, it's a very Norse name, Thorfast, who makes this little comb case. And he's obviously really proud of it because he bothers to put these runes on. Now, from this one tiny little thing, though, you see examples of essentially people in the kind of Anglo-Saxon communities who are really cross that these Norse,
It's not just the hair too. It's the whole thing that they take a bath once a week, whether they need it or not. On Saturday, we're going to take a bath. And so aren't there like instances of letters from Anglo-Saxon leaders saying, you better not start doing that Viking stuff where you're taking care of your hair and bathing all the time and acting like you're better than the rest of us. But yeah, give us that one. Yeah.
Yeah. So there's a really funny one. He's called Alfred, and he's writing to someone he calls Brother Edward around the year 1000. And he says, you do something wrong. You're trying to kind of copy these Danes that didn't give, Dane is sort of a general kind of word for the Norse, that didn't give you life, and you're trying to copy their hairstyles. I mean, quite frankly, it's embarrassing. You should be ashamed of yourself. And he very specifically refers to bare neck, so short at the back, and shaggy at the front. You know, so yeah, this, I mean, which you see if anyone's fan of Vikings, the amazing TV series, which I absolutely love. You see that very much there. You see it on the Bayeux Tapestry as well. The Normans, who are descended from the Norse, who settled in northern France. Again, they have that very stereotypical Norse hairstyle.
Yeah, and I think it's a reasonable inference, if we don't have it directly, that, you know, Viking guys are probably getting Anglo-Saxon women just because they smell better. And so that's an area of tension. We should say, we got to go to a break right here. We should say that, amusingly, when the Vikings go east, they kind of have the opposite problem in Byzantium, where there's really, you only bathe once a week? Because that is not cool. You guys got to start taking more baths. So
Ibn Fadlan, he's at Arabic, and of course he's used to, like, you wash with running water, and the description of how they bathe in the morning, all spitting into the same bowl. Oh, it's absolutely. Do we really want to go on a break from that? That feels like a rather unpleasant place.
Our listeners are used to it. Look, we haven't even started with poop yet, and we've got quite a bit to say about that as well. Okay, we'll be back with more of Eleanor Barraclough after this.
Viking of some note, loose my name and here I float out on the sea in a great big...
I had to play one dumb American rock and roll Viking song, just because I've been listening to that since 1972. Joining us today is Eleanor Barraclough, historian, writer, and broadcaster based at Bath Spa University. Her new book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. There's so much to cover, and I'm already realizing we won't get to all of my favorite things, but that's the way life is. But Eleanor, you've used the word runes several times in the previous segment, but I don't think we've really kind of explained about runes and how they go from being, I think, this intentionally arcane, secretive way of communication to, over the centuries, something everybody's doing and guys are just slagging each other off in bars with runes. So tell us a little bit about all of that whole idea of runes. And I guess we should also say, if they look a little like Roman numerals or something, that's because during the period of migration before the age of Vikings, that's another thing they did, right? They went to the Roman Empire.
Yeah, exactly that. So essentially it's that spiky alphabet that we might be used to. I mean, it's still really popular in tattoos, for example. You'll see it all over the place. We've already mentioned the HB runes that we have on our phones for Bluetooth. And yeah, so the earliest runes within a Scandinavian context, because this is important, they're not just part of the Nordic world, it's a Germanic thing. But sort of the vast majority of runes that survive are predominantly from a sort of Norse context, simply because of how history plays out. But it's the earliest runes, we were talking about hair care, combs. It's actually runes on a comb, and they're found in a Danish bog from around the year 160. And it probably reads something like Harja. No one's quite sure what that means. It might just mean comb. But it might also be about warfare, it might be the name of a tribe or something like that. And exactly as you say, the context in which these are found is really important to telling us something about where runes come from and how they develop and what they were thought to be. Because this is essentially a sacrificial bog, and you have all this war gear from the losing team, essentially, that's been shoved in the bog, maybe as an offering to whatever gods or spirits or beings lie on the other side of the waters. And there's the little comb with, these runes, Harja, on them. But there's also things that essentially come from the Roman Empire. And so although Scandinavia was never part of the Roman Empire officially, what you do see is sort of the movement of goods, the movement of ideas, the movement of auxiliaries who sort of took up roles within the Roman army. And then when they came back north, they brought these ideas back with them. And so that's why one sort of pretty good theory is that this is where these runes start. And this is why they look rather like Latin alphabet. But yeah, exactly as you say, over time, everyone starts to use them. And we were talking about how it's really hard to actually define sort of where do things start, where do things finish when it comes to the Viking Age. And certainly what I do in the book is kind of push it forwards, because we don't want to just think about, okay, this date, and we can talk about that. This date is the end of the Viking Age. Everyone living in that part of the world, in that part of the Norse diaspora, they know it's the end of the Viking Age and they all move on. Thank you very much. It's not like that at all. And certainly runes are something that, well, I mean, they're actually still being used in the 19th century in some parts of Sweden, some parts of America where they're used basically to make forgeries that look like, they're trying to pretend that Vikings got to places they didn't actually get to. But certainly sort of in the 1200s in Norway, for example, in Bergen, you have some incredible runic inscriptions. And there was a big fire down at the waterfront, Bryggen, in Bergen, where hundreds and hundreds of essentially scrappy little runic post-it notes, mostly on pieces of wood, pieces of bone, metal, were found. And yeah, it's people drunk, it's people asking their husbands.
Let's do one of, I think both of our favorite examples might be the one that says, Gita says you should go home.
Yes.
What's that all about?
I love that. So again, you've kind of got to fill in the gaps a little bit. So we can't be absolutely sure what's going on. But this is a little piece of wood with runes on it. And the runes on one side, exactly as you say, can be translated as Gita says you should go home. Gita is a woman's name, and they're found down by the waterfront. Probably, we can think it might be an area that was once essentially a tavern. Now, this is where we do have to fill in the gaps a little bit, because on the other side, someone's tried to put more runes, but they're scrawled and you can't read anything from them. And I like to think it's a bit like, occasionally if you've been drunk and you've tried to text someone back and then you look the next day and you realize it's absolute gibberish. And so what I like to think is that maybe is Gita's husband trying to be very clever and write something back to her, but essentially he's being hauled out of the pub and being told he has to go home.
They're also used for pretty complex poetry. Full of riddles and things called kenning and allusions, but also just this kind of, like, I love the one that hides the name of the woman it's about. I believe her name is Gudrun. And it's kind of, it's a love poem where her name is kind of cleverly concealed, as I understand it.
Exactly that. So this is from an area of Norway called Telemark, and it's in a stave church, one of those beautiful wooden sort of later Norse churches with those gorgeous sloping roofs. It's called Bø. And in the area where the choir sat, there's runes that have been scratched, and they're actually an alliterative poem. So alliterative, the ends of the lines don't rhyme, but the the words sort of chime across the lines, and that's a very sort of typical Norse form of poetry with this alliteration. And you could, I call it in the book, it's a cryptic crossword clue, because they say, I cannot sleep because of the sickness of the children, the worker's torment, the mountain dweller, the horse's toil, the wrecker of the hay, the thrall or slave's misfortune. Interpret that. And okay, if you're good enough to be able to actually interpret those runes and actually read them, you're doing pretty well. But actually, we can go one level down, because each rune had a name that sort of essentially matched up with its sound. And so the K rune is Koin, and this means a sore or an ulcer. So we go back to that first line of the poem. It's the sickness of children. And then we've got the U rune, which is Ur, which means sort of essentially drizzle, nasty rain. So going back to the second line, that's the worker's torment. And on it goes.
Yeah.
So there's a thorn rune, Thurs, that's the giant, that's the mountain dweller. And so by the time you get to the end of the poem, you put all those runes together, and it's Guthrun, which is I cannot sleep because of Guthrun. The implication being because I love her. Maybe it's unrequited love. So it's a really clever little sort of bit of wordplay. Who knows if there really was anyone called Gudrun who is being talked about in this poem? But because that's the wonderful thing, that the Norse absolutely loved riddles and poems, and their poets were really prized, important people. They were often sort of given exalted positions at royal courts. There's sagas written about them in Iceland, and so it's a really wonderful thing to be able to pick up these little bits of unofficial poetry and wordplay, songs, and snatches of everyday life that come out of these bits and pieces that fall through the cracks of history.
Yeah, there's this exalted poetry, but there's also just a lot of scatological stuff, and there's a lot of sexual stuff. There seems to be some heteronormative bullying going on. You get terms like Fanfluga. Say, what is Fanfluga?
So there's two. So there's Fanfluga, which means essentially a woman who runs away from a penis. And then there's Futhflugi, who's a man who runs away from a vagina. And what's so funny is, when we see these, it's kind of potty humor. It's people often being not very nice to each other at all. But again, we have to think down the layers of these meanings. For a start, the fact that people are joking about it and being mean about it probably means that it's happening somewhere. And so it's just humans being humans in all the variations that entails. But it's also true that when we look to the mythology, we look to the pagan Norse gods, people like Odin, Loki, Thor, they're often quite transgressive. They're quite sort of gender fluid. We've got Loki, for example, he's sort of the classic trickster god, but he, and according to one story, transforms himself into a mare in order to lure away a giant stallion. And then later he gives birth to the very famous 8-legged horse Sleipnir that's then ridden by Odin. So,
not only that, but I mean, so Odin services in some contexts that are not the kind of lordly Odin that we maybe associate with, say, the Marvel Cinematic Universe or something like that. And there's one that's connected to poetry. Doesn't he steal poetry from the giants? And then there's good poetry coming out of his mouth and bad poetry coming out of his butt. Something along those lines.
Exactly that. So I always think it's funny when you see Odin depicted sort of in modern culture as this, exactly as you say, this lordly figure, someone who because he's an absolute pain, and he's quite horrible and trickstery, and the poetry that's sort of put into his mouth doesn't reflect in a good light at all. He's quite devious and nasty. And so there's one story, and these stories are sort of mostly, for the most part, preserved in 13th century texts from Iceland. So we've got to think, okay, these are written down after the conversion to Christianity, which is in around the year 1000 in Iceland. But they're important. It's still part of the cultural currency, essentially. And so people need to know these stories. And so Odin, he's trying to steal the mead of poetry from the giants. And so he transforms himself into a bird and gets all the mead of poetry into his belly, and then he flies back as quickly as he can to Asgard, the home of the gods. But he's being pursued as he goes by the giant, also in a shape-shifting form. He's so frightened that essentially, he poos out some of this mead. And if you're a bad poet, maybe you, I don't know, do rubbish limericks or something like that, then that's what you've been eating. But if you're a good poet, then you've got the stuff that he managed to get over the walls and into the barrels that were waiting for him to spit out this mead of poetry.
If you like this kind of thing, by the way, you're going to have to read Eleanor's book to hear about the Lloyd's Bank Copperlight, just because we don't have time to talk about it. But it's worth it. All right. So make sure you inform yourself about that on your own. But yeah, one thing that I was thinking about, and I don't know, this might be an American perception and different from where you're sitting, but it seems to me that although I grew up reading Marvel comic books in the early stages, so I knew about Odin and Thor and Loki and things like that, but I don't think Norse mythology had the kind of Robert Graves, Edith Hamilton, popularizer, interpreter. Everybody kind of grows up knowing some Greco-Roman stuff just because it's kind of out there. It feels like this. I think it's changing now, but it feels as though it wasn't sort of bred in the bone for us quite as much.
Yeah, I think bread in the bone is a lovely way of putting it, because I think there is something in that. Certainly, there's been plenty to rectify that in recent years. I mean, Kevin and Crossley Holland, that was always the ones that we grew up with over here. And then Neil Gaiman, his version came out a couple of years ago. That there's a lot of it. It's quite interesting, isn't it? Because I think that it's a very playful sort of mythology. It's the sort of mythology you can really have a lot of fun with creatively. These aren't the sort of gods that sit on high being all good and sort of judging humanity. It's that they're gods who are badly behaved and kind of get stuck in, So, and I think that makes them a lot of fun to play with. But it means that, in terms of sort of that canonical way of thinking about who are these figures and what do they represent? Well, actually, you've kind of got to go back to the 13th century. As I say, there's this amazing Icelandic poet and politician called Snorri Sturluson, and he writes down a lot of these myths because these myths are so important to poets. And so that's really where it comes from. 19th century, everyone's very into Vikings, and so there's versions of these that do the rounds, definitely. But I don't know. Yeah, I was always more aware of them through, as you say, sort of Marvel comics and the kind of fun, cartoonish way of approaching them, which is part of the reason I was so attracted to them, to be honest.
Eleanor Barraclough, we're going to take one more quick break. We'll come back. It's killing me that we're probably not going to talk about board games or music. There's so much to cover here on the banks of this river, but we'll come back and we'll talk a little bit about the end of the Viking Age. Some time for some quick thank yous. The first one goes to the maestro, our technical producer, Dylan Reyes, who I think I've gotten him into Norsecore music. He's getting really interested in some of these groups like Skald and Waldruna. And the producer of this episode, the perfect person to do it, Lily Tyson. We're talking today to Eleanor Barraclough, historian, writer, broadcaster based at Bath Spa University. Her new book is Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age. We have to get into the end of the Viking thing, and we're pressed for time, Eleanor, but the music thing is worth mentioning. I was startled by this effort that seems to be going on right now by these groups, and they're not all based in Scandinavian countries. I think Skald is from France, and there's one called Nightland that I think is from Siberia. But and I know there are these cultural centers in places like York, England, which of course was a Viking place. It was a place that the Vikings populated. I mean, there seems to be a real interest in bringing this stuff alive, not just recreating battles.
Yeah, absolutely. And I love it. I'm obsessed by Viking music, so I'm really enjoying this. So I think this is the really interesting thing, that it's not, it can work on so many levels. You have sort of Viking metal music, which obviously isn't trying to be authentic, but is drawing on, some of these kind of mythological ideas. But then at the other end of the scale, you have really interesting groups like Wodruna. You mentioned we just made a program with them for BBC Radio, actually, where we went and talked to Einar Selvik out in Norway. And he's got all these original instruments, and he's looking at how to capture the essence. You can't, it's really hard to work out what what music would have sounded like in all sorts of ways. There's an amazing Arabic writer from the time who visits Hedeby in Denmark and says they sound like howling dogs, they're so bad at music, which is my absolutely favorite quote. He probably just caught them coming out the tavern or something. I'm sure they weren't all terrible.
Right. So and we should say that we have to sort of talk about the end of this whole thing, this whole process here. I should say also, we're going to end the show. The last music people will hear is by an artist who goes by the name Donheim. And I think in this song, he's actually playing human bones at one point. Oh, wow. That's really going Norse core. But so, Eleanor, if you were going to write the blockbuster movie about this civilization, you couldn't invent a better end than 1066 in some ways. It's a little bit Anglo-centric, but you've got this situation where King Harold Godwinson of England has an invading force led by King. It's very confusing. There's two Harolds; they spell it differently. Yes. King Harold Hardrada, and he's got the English king's brother Tostig Godwinson at his side. And a little bit later, of course, William the Conqueror is going to show up with the Norman invasion. I mean, what a finale! But it is.
Oh, it's so good.
It does feel a little bit like if there's going to be a Twilight of the Vikings, maybe it's happening right around that time.
Yes. Well, yes and no. So exactly as you say, it's Anglo-centric. It's got big players. It's dramatic. It's fascinating as a period. But I always thought, well, yeah, okay. If you're someone living, say, on Orkney or Shetland, is this actually going to affect your life, which is very sort of Norse culturally inflected at this point? Probably not. Go to 200 years later, we've got something like the Battle of Largs, which takes place. It's the King of Scotland versus the King of Norway. They're battling for the Western Isles. Go to the 15th century, and you've only then got the Northern Isles, which are sort of Orkney and Shetland, being transferred from Norwegian control to Scottish control. That's just within the British Isles, so it's so much more complicated than that. And part of it's about, well, okay, what are we seeing as the end of the Viking Age? And that's a really tricky question. We probably don't have too much time to go into that. But if we're talking about raiding, the origins of the Viking Age, if we're talking about sort of broad cultural communication and influence, well, that's still going on at that time. If we're talking about, say, the transformation from pagan religion to Christian conversion, well, then we have to take it back to around 1000 or so.
Although what's happening more at this time, 11th century, is it's becoming the official language of some of these kingdoms back, the official religion
exactly,
back in Denmark and Sweden and Norway. These kings are saying, no, we're a Christian country now, which I think is different, right?
Yeah. And important. And I mean, it happens later in Sweden and it's a bit stop-start elsewhere. But I'm absolutely fascinated. I always have been by what happens in Norse Greenland. And of course, I'm so interested in Norse Greenland anyway, because that's the kind of the reason they end up getting to the edge of North America around the year 1000. Which in itself is just mind-blowing that the world kind of joins up, the people sort of actually do, we know for a fact, make contact at that point. It's just incredible. But we have the end of Norse Greenland as a culture that is very much the product of that Viking Age expansion and the Norse culture that follows. We have that sort of fading away, essentially, in a way that's very mysterious. We don't really know a lot about it. Certainly by 1500, probably by sort of 1450 or so, the last records we have in terms of the writing, they talk of a witch burning. A man is burned for witchcraft in what is sort of known as the Eastern Settlement, which is kind of confusingly in the sort of southern part of Greenland where the Norse live. And then there's a marriage that takes place the following year. That's kind of the first decade of the 1400s. But then we have clothes that are preserved in the permafrost that are found in this Norse graveyard at Hrolfsnes. And actually, I end up kind of fading the Viking Age out with those, because for me, again, I just find it really quite hard to get my head around. Someone is laid, or, people are laid into graves there wearing those clothes by someone, and then no one follows. Those are the last people. What happened to the people who buried them? And so for me, that's the point where essentially it's like, okay, when there is no memory left, when there's no one left to tell those tales, is that the point when we can say that an era is actually over?
Yeah, we didn't talk very much about Greenland today, and obviously if people are interested in Eric the Red and Leif Erikson and stuff like that, a lot of it flows through there. We didn't talk about slaves. I think it's Leif Erikson or Eric the Red, who has this smarter than the master slave who figures out the grapes part of the reason it's going to be called Vinland. There's so much we could talk about there. But yeah, Greenland feels a little bit in your book like one of those Pacific islands where there were Japanese people who didn't know that World War II had ended for years and years. It's like Greenland doesn't know because it's so remote that Vikings are kind of over. So let's keep being Vikings.
Do you know, it really does feel a bit like that. And it's so strange. You know that the ships are not coming anymore with there's tales and there's talk of sort of ice on the old routes, because of course this is also from around about 1200, 1250 onwards. We have this little ice age. Everything is really freezing up, and they're absolutely reliant for their Norse way of life on ships coming predominantly from Norway, but also from Iceland. But as you say, it's a slow fade. But what's the point where essentially they're saying what is it? There's nobody left to come. And what does that look like? What does that feel like?
So we're almost out of time. I just want to say one thing. I figured out, so when we pitch our screenplay to the big movie companies, the ending it's still got to be 1066. And there's this incredible scene that your friend there gives us, Snorri Sturluson, where Harald Hardrada has kind of suborned or recruited the brother of King Harold Godwinson, the English king. His brother's been kind of enlisted by the invading Viking king. And Snorri gives us this little scene where this rider comes up to the Norwegian invaders and talks to Harold Hardrada and talks to Tostig, the brother of the English king, and says, you could come back and you could get your earldom. And Tostig asks, what would Hardrada get for his trouble? And the writer says 7 feet of English ground. We're going to bury that guy. And the whole thing doesn't happen. And then Snorri tells us that Harold Hardrada says, as the writer departs, who was that guy? And Tostig goes, that was my brother. The King of England. That's who just rode up to you and made you that offer. I mean, there's our ending, right? I mean, just roll credits after that, right, Eleanor?
That'll do. I might argue for a sort of an epilogue in Norse Greenland or something, but yeah, it's like a soap opera, right? We've got to end with something like that.
It's so good. And the book is so great. Embers of the Hands, Hidden Histories of the Viking Age by Eleanor Barraclough. I'm not kidding. We have barely scratched the surface of this book. It's amazing. Seek it out. You'll learn about board games and rock lifting and all kinds of other exciting things that you can do with your spare time. But Eleanor, thank you for your time today.
Thank you so much. This has been a complete pleasure, and the music has just made it. I mean, I'm boopying still over here.
All right. And the rest of you, take care of yourselves. Don't lift really, really heavy rocks until you're, practice on the smaller ones. We will be back with more later this week.